America shops at Radio Shack for everything in radios.
Not you or you, you're Sam! You win!
I'm making popcorn in the new Black & Decker Popcorn Center.
It wasn't the walls or the furniture. It was the little things that made a house feel like home. These forgotten objects once lived in every home, quiet, constant, and filled with memories. You might have forgotten them, but they remember you. In the hallway of nearly every American house from the early 1900s through the 1980s, there was a small architectural detail that most kids today would just walk past without thinking twice. It was not a full room. It was not even a table. It was the telephone niche, a little built-in shelf, sometimes tucked into the wall like a secret, sometimes out in the open, proudly part of the daily routine. This was the official headquarters for family communication. The rotary phone rested right there, its spiral cord dangling like a stubborn vine, twisted from years of pacing and talking. Beneath it sat a notepad with torn corners, a pen that only worked if you tapped it 3 times, and of course, the address book, thicker than a Bible and just as sacred. You might even see emergency numbers scribbled on masking tape right on the wall. Every ring of that phone meant something. A birthday wish, a job offer, a neighbor sharing gossip hotter than the oven. If the hallway was the heart of the home, the telephone niche was its heartbeat. And once you remember that little corner, you start remembering other pieces of domestic genius, like the one thing that turned every living room into a 5-star dining room without anyone ever leaving the couch. Tin television trays, you know the ones. Folding legs, painted flowers, maybe a bird or two perched awkwardly near the corner. They were like pop-up magic tricks for dinner time. You would unfold one, snap it into place, and suddenly you were royalty eating off fine china, except it was baked ziti on a cartoon plate and the queen was I Love Lucy or Bonanza. These trays were an unspoken invitation to slow down, eat up, and maybe spill a little. They came in sets. You would keep them stacked in the corner, leaned up behind the recliner, or stored in a metal rack that squeaked every time you moved it. And no one cared if the paint chipped. That just meant it had character. You remember waiting for your show to come on, tray ready, paper towel napkin folded in half like a tuxedo. This was dinner and a show, 1960s style. Those trays taught us that food was not just nourishment. It was a moment. And moments were worth sitting down for. But the real charm came after dinner, when the parents would kick back with a drink, and that is where the next forgotten favorite hung on the wall like a quiet old friend. Somewhere near the kitchen, usually above the sink or on the side of a wooden pantry cabinet, lived something you probably never gave a second thought to, until now. A bottle opener, bolted to the wall, ready for action. Sometimes it was shaped like a Coca-Cola cap. Other times it looked like it belonged in a garage, all heavy and cast iron. The bottle opener did not move. It did not need batteries. It never stopped working. You just popped the cap, heard that fizzy hiss, and the little metal tray below, if you had one, caught the cap like a souvenir. Every dad, uncle, and neighbor seemed to have one of these. Back when beer came in glass bottles and soda was a treat for guests, the wall-mounted bottle opener was the start of many small celebrations. You could always count on it during barbecue season or when your father finally fixed the lawnmower. You did not ask it for much, but somehow it was always there when you needed it. And if you think a chunk of metal on the wall could carry that much weight, wait until you remember the warm, silent presence of a little fabric sign that told you everything would be just fine. Bless this house. You have probably seen it stitched in blue, maybe green, with 2 little doves perched under a roof. It hung in the hallway, in the kitchen, or right above the mantel, whispering a kind of everyday prayer without ever making a sound. Embroidered samplers like these were not just decoration. They were a kind of gentle anchor. Most were homemade, pulled together by nimble fingers with embroidery hoops and spools of thread that sat on laps while the television buzzed in the background. If they were not made by someone in the family, they were gifted with a handwritten card and a smile that said, "I thought of you." Sometimes they came framed in wood, sometimes just pinned up on the wall with thumbtacks. No one minded. They were supposed to be humble. That was the whole point. Bless this house was more than a phrase. It was a reflection of what mattered. Family, warmth, safety, It was one of the few things you could count on always being there, no matter how much moved or changed. But right next to those stitched words, maybe even underneath them, you would probably find a stack of something even heavier than it looked. The Sears and Roebuck catalog, or J.C. Penney, or Montgomery Ward. You remember those massive books, right? They were less catalogs and more like dreams with price tags. Sitting on the coffee table or hidden under it, they were glossy, thick, and stuffed with everything a kid could want, or a grown-up could imagine affording one day. Toys, tools, drapes, kitchen gadgets, suits, perfume. It was all in there. And if you were lucky, your parents let you circle the items you liked with a pen, even if you both knew those wishes were just that. Wishes. These catalogs doubled as booster seats at family dinners and helped little ones reach the sink in the bathroom. They were part of the daily routine. You would flip through them while waiting for your show to start, or just to pass time on a rainy afternoon. Pages dog-eared, covers worn down, some even missing entire chunks from use. There was something so powerful about holding a book that seemed to hold everything. It made home feel bigger than it was, and while flipping pages may have sparked your imagination, it was what waited outside, hanging quietly on the line, that brought a kind of peace you cannot package in any catalog. You did not need a dryer to get that fresh linen scent, just a little sunshine, a backyard, and a sturdy clothesline. It is hard to describe the rhythm of laundry day without sounding like you are writing a lullaby. But that is exactly what it felt like. Quiet, measured, satisfying. Wooden clothespins clipped with a snap, each one holding up shirts, socks, and pillowcases like tiny victories in the wind. You would walk the line, pin by pin, with a wicker basket at your hip and maybe a little radio playing in the distance. And when the breeze came through, the sheets danced like they were performing just for you. Even kids found joy in ducking under the hanging clothes, running through like it was a maze built just for them. Sure, a clothesline was practical. It saved on electricity, and it was good for the planet before anyone talked about being green. But more than that, it made home feel alive. You could literally see your day's work swaying in the wind. And once everything came back inside, warm from the sun, it was folded into drawers that held something just as timeless and quietly beautiful. Delicate little treasures made of a strange kind of cloudy white glass. Milk glass. You have seen it before, even if you did not know what it was called. That soft, semi-opaque white glass with little raised designs and a porcelain feel. It was everywhere. On top of dressers, in kitchen hutches, on coffee tables full of hard candies that stuck together by the time you reached in. Some people used them for flower vases. Others just liked how they looked. They came in the shapes of hens, goblets, tiny baskets, or even elaborate bowls with scalloped edges. It was not flashy. That was the beauty of it. Milk glass was humble elegance, just enough to brighten up a room without trying too hard. And it was passed down, from mothers to daughters, from grandmothers to newlyweds. It was not expensive, but it felt like treasure. You knew you had to be careful with it. It could chip if you were not gentle. So, you learned to be gentle. You learned that home meant taking care of the little things. And sometimes, right next to that candy dish or sitting under a vase of plastic carnations, there was something even more sacred. A book so important you barely dared to open it. But when you did, the past came tumbling out. The family Bible. You did not mess with it. You did not rest your coffee mug on it. You did not doodle in the margins. That book held more than scriptures. It held the very record of your family's life. Inside the front cover, handwritten in careful cursive, were the names of people you had never met but somehow loved anyway. Great uncles, cousins lost too young, births marked with joy, deaths with a little cross next to the date. It was like holding a time capsule that smelled faintly of dust and furniture polish. This Bible usually lived on the coffee table or in a drawer of the china cabinet, sometimes displayed openly, sometimes tucked away, but always within reach. If a visitor asked about it, someone would proudly bring it out, flip through the delicate pages, and point to names with a reverence that felt sacred. It was not just a book. It was memory stitched into paper. And it reminded everyone in the house where they came from. Of course, not everything preserved in the home was so formal. Some heirlooms were made of metal, covered in paint, and sat quietly next to the toilet like it was the most natural thing in the world. Let me paint you a picture, literally. You walk into the bathroom and there it is. A metal trash can, hand-painted with flowers, maybe strawberries, maybe tiny little bluebirds. Toll painting, they called it. A fancy name for what was basically folk art with heart. These trash cans were not hidden away. They were proudly placed beside vanities or near the toilet, like a small sign that even the most forgettable corners of the home deserved beauty. The base was usually tin or aluminum, light enough to dent, strong enough to last through the years. You would see them in pastel colors, matched to the wallpaper or the rug, sometimes even forming part of a coordinated bathroom set with matching tissue holders and soap dishes. And they were always clean, almost suspiciously so, because throwing something into a painted trash can somehow felt like you were doing something rude. They were never just containers, they were art. And that idea of dressing up the ordinary, that spilled into everything. Even the spare toilet paper roll needed to look its best. And that is when something truly unforgettable showed up, something that turned necessity into nostalgia with a smile and a little yarn wig. It is one of those things you either remember vividly or think you dreamed up. The knitted toilet paper cover doll, a plastic doll torso with a crocheted dress that draped down to hide a spare roll of toilet paper. It sounds ridiculous because it was. And yet, there it sat, on the back of the toilet tank or perched on a shelf, proud as could be. Sometimes her dress matched the bathroom towels. Sometimes it had ruffles for days. These were made by hand, by mothers, grandmothers, maybe even that neighbor who sold them at the church bazaar. You did not question their existence. They were just there, like wallpaper or toothpaste. But looking back, they were something more. They were a little dose of dignity, a way to take something as mundane as toilet paper and give it a bit of ceremony. Because in those days, nothing in the house was too small to care about. And even the most modest bathroom became a showroom of love, creativity, and crochet patterns. It was homemade charm in its purest form. And just down the hall, maybe right in the corner of the living room, was another sign that company was coming, and the grown-ups were getting ready for something special. You always knew when company was coming. The lights got a little warmer, the good snacks came out, and in the corner of the living room, someone rolled out the bar cart. This was not just a place to stash liquor. No, this was a statement, a symbol that your home was ready to entertain, even if your version of entertaining meant 3 couples from the block sipping highballs while swapping meatloaf recipes. The rolling cart bar had everything: cut glass decanters filled with mystery amber liquids, tongs for the ice no one ever used, and swizzle sticks that somehow multiplied over time. There might have been an ashtray that matched the coasters, and a cocktail shaker that had not moved in 5 years but still looked ready for action. Some carts even had wheels that squeaked just enough to announce their presence like a trumpet. And if you were a kid, you knew not to touch it, unless you wanted to catch an earful. These bar carts made any home feel a little bit fancier, a little more grown up. They were a passport to sophistication, even if the most exotic thing on them was a bottle of ginger ale. And right beside that cart, probably in the kitchen humming quietly, an appliance that made getting ice feel like a full-body workout. Before ice came out of your fridge door like a vending machine at a hotel, it came from something far less glamorous: metal ice cube trays. You had to wrestle with these things like they owed you money. A handle in the center, a crank, or a lever you pulled up and twisted with all the strength your wrist could manage. When it worked, it made a sound that was equal parts satisfying and terrifying. A cracking pop, like the ice was surrendering. If it did not work, well, you got your fingers wet and tried again. These trays were made of aluminum, and they froze water fast, but clung to each cube like it was personal. You would fill them carefully so they did not overflow, slide them into the freezer, and pray that nobody tipped them sideways when reaching for the peas. The trays would stack, rattle, and slowly collect frost like they had been forgotten in the Arctic. But they were dependable, and nothing felt cooler, literally, than plopping a perfectly square ice cube into your glass. That sound was its own reward, and once you looked past the freezer, you probably noticed something else in the kitchen, something louder than any color had a right to be. Avocado green, harvest gold, copper tone brown. These were not just paint colors. These were an identity. A kitchen with one of these appliances did not whisper, it shouted. The refrigerator, the stove, the dishwasher, they were all dressed like they belonged on the cover of a homemaker magazine. And for a while, they did. These colors were not chosen at random. They represented warmth, earthiness, optimism. At least, that is what the marketing folks said. In reality, they were just bold. Wildly bold. A gold oven door felt like you were cooking in a spaceship. An avocado green fridge meant your kitchen was cooler than most diners, and people took pride in that. Appliances were not meant to disappear. They were meant to be seen. Even the knobs and dials had a kind of retro charm. Big, chunky, and mechanical enough to make you feel like you were launching something. Over time, the shine faded, the enamel chipped, and trends changed. But for a long time, those colors ruled the American kitchen like royalty. And just a few feet away, maybe in the living room, was a wooden cabinet that had its own surprises inside, a piece of furniture that turned every Friday night into a concert. The console stereo was a beautiful lie. It looked like a dresser, or a sideboard, or maybe just a really large box with wood paneling. But open that lid, gently, because the hinges could be temperamental, and suddenly you had a full-blown music machine, a turntable tucked away under a heavy lid, knobs that clicked when you turned them, speakers that buzzed and hummed like they were alive. And when you dropped the needle, the bass did not come through a wire. It came through the wood itself. You did not just listen to records. You felt them. You could hear Perry Como, Aretha Franklin, or Elvis Presley vibrating through the floorboards. Some of these stereos even had space to store your records, neatly filed away like legal documents in the court of cool. And it was not just music. Sometimes you would catch the ball game on the radio through the same console. It brought sound into the home in a way that felt like magic. And when the music stopped and the night settled in, something else kept track of the rhythm of the home. Something on the wall that never let you forget what time it was. Tick, tock, bong. If you grew up in a house with a Westminster chime clock, you know that sound like your own heartbeat. Every 15 minutes, like clockwork, because it was clockwork, it would play its gentle, echoing tune. Some were mounted on the wall, others stood tall in the corner like grandfather clocks with serious posture. But the melody was always the same, a soft, slow chime that somehow made time feel kind. These clocks were not there to be trendy. They were there to keep order. They reminded you when it was time to go to school, when dinner needed to come out of the oven, when Dad's show was about to start, and when they chimed on the hour, they did it proudly, as if to say, "Look at us, still going." The sound could be a little haunting in the dead of night, but somehow it was never scary. It was comforting, familiar, like the voice of the house itself, quietly keeping track of your day. You could always count on it. And just below that clock, in a room you were probably not allowed to enter without socks on, was something delicate, serious, and entirely off-limits to anyone under the age of 20. It sat on the counter, or maybe tucked into a kitchen drawer. A wooden or tin recipe box no bigger than a tissue box, but somehow heavy enough to feel like a brick of memories. Inside were handwritten index cards, some in flowing cursive, others in blocky grandma print, all stained with time. You had Aunt Carol's Jell-O salad, complete with canned fruit and suspiciously wobbly textures. Nana's Magic Bars, which required a specific brand of chocolate chips, or the whole thing was ruined. The box was organized, but only barely. Some cards were bent, some had food splatters. A few were so faded that only Mom could decipher them. But each one held more than ingredients. It held tradition. You pulled out that card, followed the directions, and suddenly the house smelled like a memory. Birthdays, Sunday potlucks, the time Dad tried to bake and forgot the sugar. Recipe boxes were love in paper form, passed down without fanfare, always nearby when needed. And while the food filled your belly, the boxes filled your soul. Of course, some items in the house had dual identities, like the cheerful holiday tin that promised popcorn and delivered something very different by the time spring rolled around. You remember the sound, that sharp metallic pop when you pried the lid off. You thought you were getting popcorn, maybe caramel, cheddar, or butter, all in their own little compartments. But by February, that same tin, usually covered in snowmen, reindeer, or a town blanketed in snow, had transformed. Now it held a tangled mess of sewing thread, dull needles, safety pins, and that one thimble no one ever used. It was the sewing kit. And the funny thing is, no one ever told you this was going to happen. It just did. When the popcorn was gone, the tin lived on. It moved under beds, into closets, or behind the living room chair. But the second a button popped off or a seam gave way, someone, probably mom or grandma, would pull it out like a magician. Inside was everything. Tiny scissors that barely worked, scraps of fabric from projects long finished, and thread in every color but the one you actually needed. These tins were homemade toolboxes. Improvised, yes, but reliable, absolutely. And they carried a kind of quiet humor, how something so festive could become so practical. Speaking of practical, that same sense of cleverness extended to how we dressed up the furniture too. They were everywhere. On the coffee table, on the nightstand, draped across the top of the television set like a lace halo. Crochet doilies, made by hand usually, or picked up at church bazaars, yard sales, or from that one aunt who could turn a ball of yarn into fine art. Some were perfectly circular. Others had patterns so intricate you had to squint just to admire them. They served no obvious purpose, and yet they were essential. A doily said, "This surface matters." It turned a plain wooden table into a polite display. It gave your flower vase or porcelain figurine a little stage to sit on. And even when they gathered dust, they somehow made the dust look decorated. You did not wash them often, and when you did, you laid them flat like they were relics. Because in a way they were, little webs of tradition, quiet declarations of care. Even kids learned to respect the doily. You could play near it, just not on it. And while these delicate things gave every surface a sense of grace, there was something else in the house that made you feel like you were living in the future, even if it barely worked. Somewhere on the wall, maybe near the kitchen or tucked into a hallway, there was a little box with a speaker grill and a talk button, the intercom. Or maybe you had the Deluxe setup, a central vacuum system with wall ports and a long hose that made you feel like a ghostbuster. These gadgets were the promise of modern convenience, whispered sweetly by the brochures of the 1960s and 1970s. But more often than not, the intercom only worked in the kitchen and one bedroom. The rest? Static or silence. And that vacuum? It had impressive suction, at least the first year. After that, you were lucky if it picked up anything heavier than a paperclip. Still, they made you feel like the future had arrived. You did not have to shout across the house anymore. You pressed a button and said, "Dinner's ready," like you were running a hotel. And even when it failed with charm. Because having these systems meant your house had levels, it had style, it had ambition. And ambition was all around, especially in the hallway where every inch of wall space told the story of awkward smiles, crooked haircuts, and the slow, beautiful journey of growing up. There was always a wall, usually in the hallway, sometimes near the stairs, and it held the history of every bad haircut, missing tooth, and forced smile your family ever captured. The school portrait wall. Each child got their own row, with one picture per year, kindergarten to 12th grade. You could track puberty in real time. Bangs too short in 3rd grade. Braces by 6th. The weird attempt at a mustache in 9th. And yet, no one ever took them down. Because these were not just photos. They were mile markers. Proof that your home was full of life. Sometimes the frames matched, other times they were a chaotic mix of wood, metal, and whatever was on sale at the drugstore. But that wall meant something. It told visitors, "This is who we are. These are our people." You might laugh at the old outfits, the denim vests, the turtlenecks, the feathered hair. But behind every photo was a story, a phase, a memory of what it felt like to grow up in that house. And while those portraits aged on the wall, another kind of timeless relic sat quietly on the coffee table or end shelf, something much heavier than it looked and just as permanent. The glass grape cluster. You remember it, you just maybe never understood why it was there. A bunch of translucent glass orbs, all glued together on a fake wooden stem, usually purple or green. It was heavy, heavier than it had any right to be, and weirdly cold to the touch. Every house seemed to have one, often placed on a coffee table like it was fine sculpture. And to a kid, it was confusing, because it looked exactly like candy. You wanted to bite it. Sometimes you did, and you learned quickly that those grapes did not play. But for the grown-ups, it was mid-century elegance, a little splash of color, a conversation piece. It was the kind of decoration that nobody ever questioned, yet nobody could explain. It was just there, like the wallpaper or the thermostat. Maybe it reminded someone of Tuscany, or maybe it just matched the couch. Whatever the reason, it stayed for years, sometimes decades, a silent, shiny part of the furniture family. It was one of those objects that never broke, never moved, and never got thrown out, even when no one remembered where it came from. And right across the room, under the kitchen cabinet, there was something else humming with just as much character, something that brought voices into the house, right alongside bacon and eggs. It crackled, it buzzed, and sometimes it picked up stations from 3 towns over. But that little under-the-cabinet AM radio was a lifeline. Every kitchen had one. Installed like an appliance, it was wedged under the cabinet near the sink or the stove, just close enough that you could tune in while cooking. The dial was analog. The antenna was bent, but it worked. It was always on, usually set to a news station or talk radio. Maybe you heard the weather forecast while flipping pancakes. Maybe it was Paul Harvey telling the rest of the story while you chopped onions. That radio was not just background noise, it was a kind of company. You could burn a casserole, but you never missed the news at noon. You might forget the salt, but never the sound of that familiar voice. It filled the room when the house was quiet, and it made chores feel a little less lonely. There were no Bluetooth speakers, no playlists, just that scratchy, dependable voice on the AM dial. And sometimes someone would turn it up, cup their ear and shout, "Hush, I want to hear this." That was a sacred moment, one you did not interrupt. And while that radio kept the airwaves full, the fridge door kept something else alive, a tiny, colorful history of everywhere you had been and everyone you needed on speed dial. The fridge was not just for food. It was for memories, for business cards, for little plastic rectangles that clung to the door like badges, fridge magnets. Every house had them. Some advertised local pizza places, buy one, get one free. Others were shaped like plumbing trucks or smiling cartoon veterinarians. They came from Little League sponsors, birthday party favor bags, or holiday parades, and each one earned its place. They were the yellow pages of the kitchen. Before smartphones or Google Maps, you just glanced at the fridge to get your oil changed or order dinner. Some magnets held up coupons. Others pinned up school art projects, reminder notes, or old grocery lists. The strongest magnets, the ones shaped like fruit or oversized clothespins, got prime real estate. But even the flimsy ones had their spot. Each magnet was more than an ad. It was a snapshot of where you were, who you called, and what mattered. And when one fell off, it somehow felt like a piece of history had slipped. They turned the refrigerator into a collage of your life, a constantly shifting mural of errands, phone numbers, and memories. And when the fridge hummed and the kitchen quieted, you might wander into the living room, where fun came in a cardboard box, even if that box had seen better days. The board games never had all their pieces, and somehow it did not matter. You had Monopoly with half the hotels gone, Clue with the lead pipe missing, Scrabble with letters worn down to blanks, but you still played. The boxes were torn. The instructions had been rewritten in someone's handwriting, probably because the original was lost under the couch in 1973. Yet, these games were gold. They came out on rainy days, family nights, and holidays when the television just was not enough. Everyone had their favorite. Grandpa always chose the race car. Your cousin was somehow unbeatable at checkers. The dice were probably replacements. The spinners wobbled. The plastic money was all mixed up. But that never stopped the fun. The laughter was real. The competition was half serious. The memories? They stuck around longer than the cardboard ever could. These games did more than pass the time. They brought people together, around the floor, around the table, around the idea that winning did not really matter, laughing did. And that, maybe more than anything, is what made every house feel like home. A place where even the missing pieces still fit. A place where the small things, those forgotten things, held more meaning than anyone ever realized. Choppers in the 1970s were not just bikes, they were statements, and the louder and longer the fork, the bolder the message. You would see motorcycles with 6-foot extended forks cruising down the highway like something out of a comic book. These things had no front brakes, almost no suspension, and about as much handling control as a brick on roller skates. But nobody cared. They looked cool. And back then, looking cool was more important than stopping safely. Builders would chop down factory models, stretch out the frames, and slap on as much chrome as humanly possible. The longer it looked, the better. Riding one meant you had guts, or just no fear of potholes. Amazingly, these were all street legal. You could register a motorcycle with modifications that today would not make it past a parking lot inspection. There were no federal mandates on motorcycle geometry or braking systems. If it ran, it rode. Eventually, the law caught up, and these extreme builds got shut down by new regulations. But at the time, choppers were everywhere, from biker rallies to small-town roads, rolling art with no regard for physics. If you think that sounds wild, wait until you picture someone doing their weekly grocery run on a riding lawnmower. Commercial jingles in the 1980s were not just background noise. They were the soundtrack of your childhood. Short, catchy, and borderline hypnotic. From "I do not want to grow up, I am a Toys R Us kid" to my buddy, wherever I go, he goes." These little songs became national earworms. You knew the tune before you even understood the product. And even now, decades later, you probably remember all the lyrics without trying. Fast food chains, toys, theme songs for cereal, they all knew how to brand themselves right into your brain. And we loved it. These were not just ads. They were pop culture. Kids would sing them on the playground like they were chart-topping hits. Some even had dance routines. And the best ones? They felt like a little burst of joy in between the shows you came to watch. It was marketing, sure, but it was also magic. A 30-second clip that made you beg your parents for action figures, Happy Meals, or the latest sugary snack with a weird mascot. And yes, even today, if you hear the opening note of gimme a break," you know exactly what is coming. But when it came to making your own mix of hits, that required serious patience and a strong dislike for chatty radio DJs. Going to the gas station used to be fun. I am not even kidding. In the 1970s, pulling into a station was not just about filling up the tank, it was about what you got for free. Gas station giveaways were the absolute jackpot of roadside errands. You would get real glassware, like full-on drinking glasses with cartoon characters or sports team logos printed on them. There were dishes, figurines, tiny toys, even aluminum tumblers in wild colors. Some stations had full sets you could collect over time, which meant every gas stop felt like you were unlocking a new piece in the puzzle. Parents would even choose where to fill up based on who had the best freebies that week. And kids? We kept track. We knew which stations had the cool tumblers and which ones were slacking. Sometimes they even gave out trading stamps to go along with your haul, so it was a 2-for-1 deal. You might not remember the cost of gas back then, but you definitely remember that little thrill when the attendant handed over your freebie through the car window. It was like a tiny prize for just living life. But if you think that was exciting, Wait until you hear about the one thing that made kids count down the days from summer to winter, flipping through pages and circling dreams. Blank VHS tapes were not just empty plastic boxes. They were treasure chests, the kind you could label, relabel, and fill up with your own little corner of television history. You remember the sound, right? That whirring click as the VCR accepted your latest recording project, whether it was The Muppet Show, a Disney movie airing on Saturday night, or just some random commercials you ended up watching later like they were rare artifacts. Back then, taping something off television was serious business. You had to time it perfectly. Hit record at just the right moment, or risk catching the tail end of a news anchor saying, "And now," before your show started. Fast-forwarding past commercials felt like a power move. Rewinding? An art form. And if you had one of those little tape rewinder machines shaped like a car, you were basically living in luxury. You wrote on those little white stickers with a level of care that rivaled school projects. Do not tape over. Disney only. Toys R Us ad. Keep forever. And when someone in the house recorded over your stuff with a football game, that was war. But if you wanted to really test your patience and your brain power, there was only one screen-based challenge that ruled them all. In the 1970s, if you lived out in the country and owned a tractor, you basically owned a car, a truck, and a parade float all in one. Tractors were not just for farms, they were the rural equivalent of a commuter vehicle. Need to get to the store? Take the tractor. Dropping by your neighbor's house 3 miles down a dirt road? Tractor again. There was no need for plates, registration, or insurance. The rules were simple. If it moved and it did not break anything, it was fair game. Authorities looked the other way because honestly, who was going to ticket the guy who also grew their corn? It was a slower time, and we mean that literally. You would see 20-mile-per-hour traffic jams with a full line of cars behind one of these beasts, and no one really minded. Today, you need plates, reflectors, and often a permit to drive a tractor even a block away from your land. But back then, tractors were as common on rural roads as pickup trucks, and a whole lot louder. Before Fandango or streaming apps told us what was playing, there was the operator, and calling the theater was an event in itself. You would dial a number, usually a long one, and wait as a robotic voice or sometimes an actual person listed off every movie in Showtime like it was the State of the Union. Showtimes for the weekend of July 24th, Gremlins at 7:30, The Goonies at 9:15, Ghostbusters at 10:45. You could not skip ahead. You had to listen. Carefully, and maybe even write it down if you were planning a big night. If someone in the house picked up the phone while you were listening, forget it. You had to start over. And if you called during a busy hour, good luck hearing anything over the static and background noise. But it was still exciting. The build-up, the anticipation. You felt like you were about to join something important, something bigger than yourself. Because back then, watching a movie meant going somewhere. It meant tickets, seats, sticky floors, and that one kid who always threw popcorn. It meant magic. But if you wanted movie magic at home, you did not need a theater. You just needed to clear your schedule, grab the good blanket, and stake your claim on the couch. Phones in the 1970s were not private, not even close. They had cords, long spiral ones that stretched down hallways, wrapped around doors, and somehow always ended up tangled. Every house had one line, maybe two if you were fancy. That meant when the phone rang, it was anyone's guess who would answer and who would listen. If you were a kid trying to call a friend, you had to pass through a gauntlet of parents and siblings just to get 5 minutes of conversation. And if you were a teenager, good luck. Eavesdropping was practically a sport. Someone would quietly pick up another receiver and breathe like a horror movie villain. You would hear that subtle click and knew you were not alone. Get off the phone became a daily soundtrack, and heaven help you if someone else needed the line. I'm expecting a call meant you had to wrap it up, no matter what life-changing gossip you were in the middle of. There was no voicemail, no caller ID. If you missed a call, it was just gone. But if you wanted real independence as a kid, you had to earn it. And for many, that meant waking up while it was still dark, grabbing a heavy canvas bag and heading out into the cold. Kit cars were the adult version of a Lego set, if Legos went 70 miles per hour and could possibly explode. You would order a fiberglass body from a catalog, bolt it onto a salvaged frame from a junkyard car, and presto, you had a custom ride. There were kits styled to look like sports cars, vintage racers, or even futuristic space cruisers. No two were ever quite the same, and that was the charm. What was missing? Crash testing, emissions control, reliable seatbelts, minor stuff. Laws eventually caught on and tightened up hard. Nowadays, building a kit car is like applying for a pilot's license with extra paperwork. But in the 1970s, it was a golden age for homegrown horsepower. Yet none of these Frankenstein rides held a candle to the tank-sized beast that was the used checker cab turned personal car. Made-for-television movies in the 1980s were not just filler. They were events. Whole nights were planned around them. When that promo would come on, this Sunday, only on ABC, you would perk up, lean in, and make mental notes to not miss it. This was before DVR, before pause buttons. You missed it? You missed it. These movies had titles like The Day After, V, The Final Battle, or The Ewok Adventure. Some were tearjerkers, some were thrillers, some were straight-up terrifying, and they had you glued to the screen, wondering how they managed to squeeze so much drama into 2 hours. Plus, commercials. Families would make popcorn, dim the lights, and treat it like it was an actual premiere. You watched it live together, and you talked about it the next day at school, because chances were everyone saw it too. They hit different. The music, the narration, even that grainy picture, it all added to the mood. You were not just watching, you were part of something. And right in the middle of those movies came the strange intermissions, ones that could go from innocent to haunting in 5 seconds flat. Saturday mornings in the 1970s were sacred. You did not sleep in. You woke up early, grabbed the biggest bowl you could find, filled it with sugary cereal, and plopped down in front of the television. This was not just a casual routine. It was a ritual. You only had a few golden hours before the grown-up programs kicked in, and every second counted. The lineup? Legendary. Looney Tunes, Scooby-Doo, the Super Friends, the Jetsons. But nestled between the slapstick and sound effects were something sneakier: public service announcements. You would be watching Bugs Bunny one minute, and the next, a little cartoon light bulb wearing sneakers would hop on screen singing, "I'm just a Bill." Suddenly, you were learning about how laws were made and the importance of brushing your teeth, all while still chewing on marshmallow shapes. And somehow, it worked. Time for Timer told you about cheese and crackers. Schoolhouse Rock gave you grammar. These messages were as much a part of your childhood as the shows themselves. They blended right into the backdrop of your Saturday, like static in between the channels. You did not always understand them, but you remembered them. And as soon as you heard the first jingle in the distance, the real fun began. Because there was something coming that could get every kid off the couch in seconds. Get this, in the 1970s, there was no law stopping you from turning an old school bus into your family's home on wheels. You could snag a decommissioned bus for next to nothing, rip out the seats, toss in a mattress, a couple beanbags, and maybe a stovetop, and call it a camper. No certification, no inspections, no zoning permits, just pure imagination and the scent of diesel. Families would paint them wild colors, load them with mismatched furniture, and hit the road like modern pioneers. They did not have running water. Some barely had brakes. But they were mobile, cozy, and dirt cheap. There was something kind of magical about the idea. Taking your whole life, putting it on a bus, and driving until the road ran out. Today, you would need to pass a dozen inspections just to get halfway down the street. But in the 1970s, you did not need a license to be an adventure seeker on wheels. Now, if you thought turning a school bus into a camper was daring, wait until you hear about the three-wheeled wonders that are claimed to be safer than a sedan. Making a mixtape in the 1980s was not just about the music, it was about what the music meant. This was not a playlist you could throw together in 5 minutes. This was a curated collection of feelings, carefully selected for maximum emotional impact. Every track had a purpose. Every order was intentional. You did not just make mixtapes for yourself. You made them for friends, for crushes, for breakups, for birthdays, for sitting in your room, staring at the ceiling, thinking deep thoughts you had no business thinking at that age. You would spend hours hitting pause and record, rewinding to check the transition, trying to fit exactly the right number of songs on each side without cutting one off too soon. There was a science to it, a rhythm, a philosophy, and then came the cover art. Doodles, stickers, fake band logos, scribbled lyrics, little hearts and broken hearts. The label on a mixtape said everything about who you were or who you wanted to be. These tapes were gifts, time capsules, emotional resumes. You gave one to someone and it meant something. It meant a lot. But if you did not have the patience or just wanted to cheat the system a little, you could always get a dozen albums for the price of a gumball. Almost. The greatest performers of the 1970s did not always have their names on marquees. Sometimes they were just the neighborhood kids putting on a backyard circus or a homemade talent show. And it was epic. Someone would make a hand-drawn poster using crayons and tape it to every mailbox on the street. Another kid would bring out a wobbly card table and pretend to sell tickets. You had gymnasts flipping through hula hoops, magicians fumbling through card tricks, and singers belting out radio hits into a hairbrush. If you had a dog that could sit, that dog was now part of the act. And your little brother? He was definitely going to be the assistant, whether he liked it or not. These shows were never perfect. Costumes fell apart, music cut out, and someone always cried halfway through. But it did not matter. The parents sat on folding chairs or blankets in the grass and clapped like they were at Radio City Music Hall. It was community. It was chaos. It was childhood. And when the show was over, the kids would bow, proud and breathless. But the moment you stepped back inside the house, another kind of performance was underway, trying to sneak in a private phone call when the entire household was listening in. In the 1970s, tourist towns across America fell in love with the exotic charm of tuk tuks and rickshaws, those little three-wheeled wonders that looked more at home in Bangkok than on a beachfront boulevard in Florida. But there they were, buzzing around like mosquito-sized taxis, legally driving alongside full-sized cars and trucks. Some were imported directly from Asia. Others were homemade contraptions cobbled together in backyard sheds using scooter engines and whatever metal scraps were lying around. They barely had suspension. Their top speed was a hopeful 25 miles per hour, and turning corners felt like rolling dice. But city officials thought they were charming, tourists loved them, and for a brief moment, they were as American as funnel cake. You could drive one of these with nothing more than a regular driver's license and a little bit of nerve. No airbags, no crumple zones, no real doors, and sometimes no roof either. They were part carnival ride, part cab, and somehow fully legal. Eventually, rising safety concerns and tighter import regulations shut them down on public streets, pushing them into novelty rides at festivals or private events. Still, for a while, you really could get picked up from your hotel in a tuk tuk. And if that sounds sketchy, imagine cruising through a rainstorm in a car that did not even come with windshield wipers. The Peachy folder was like a social billboard. Everyone had one. Those tan or yellow folders with athletes printed in faded ink on the front, football players mid-tackle, baseball players mid-swing. They were meant to be neutral, practical, but they never stayed that way. Because the moment that folder landed on your desk, it became a war zone of doodles, lightning bolts, band logos, stencils, flames, hearts with names inside them, graffiti letters that took 15 tries to get right. Every inch of it became your personal art gallery or battlefield. These things aged like ancient relics by the time June came around. It did not matter how boring the class was. Your Peachy folder made sure you had something to focus on, something to claim. And if a substitute teacher tried to take it away, that was a declaration of war. Of course, personal style extended beyond the page, because it was not just about what you carried. It was about what you wore. And in the 1980s, you had better know how to roll your jeans, or risk social exile. That high-pitched tone, you remember it. You might even feel it in your chest right now. The emergency broadcast system test did not care what you were doing. It took over everything. You could be watching your favorite cartoon, a family sitcom, or a game show with flashing lights, and suddenly the screen would freeze, a gray static box would appear, and that bone-chilling noise would wail through the speakers. Then came the voice, always monotone, always distant. "This is a test. This is only a test." Even though they told you it was just a drill, it still felt like the end of the world was knocking. You sat still, stared at the screen, and waited for it to go away. Some kids covered their ears, others ran to find a parent. It was spooky in a way you could not explain. You did not know what nuclear war was, not really, but you knew this test meant something big, something adult, something terrifying. After a minute or two, it would vanish, and the show would come back on like nothing happened. But you felt different. That noise lived in your bones. Still, once the fear passed, you went back to being a kid. And in the 1970s, being a kid meant making your own fun, sometimes by putting on a show right in your backyard. Three-wheeled Tririccars were one of the stranger automotive experiments to come out of the 1970s, and somehow they were totally legal to drive on regular roads. Companies like Dale and Myers tried to pitch these oddball vehicles as the future of safe, affordable transportation. But here's the twist. They were wildly unstable. They looked like space pods, handled like shopping carts, and tipped over if you so much as looked at a corner the wrong way. Some of them were so light, 2 people could lift one side off the ground. Still, they were street legal. There were no strict safety standards for this sort of thing, and as long as it had a license plate and functioning lights, it could hit the road. The idea was to offer fuel efficiency and savings during the oil crisis, but in practice, they were more likely to cause whiplash than save gas. That did not stop eager drivers from picking them up and zooming around town like extras from a science fiction movie. Today, these vehicles have either vanished completely or landed in museums as cautionary tales. But if that sounds bizarre, just wait until we tell you about kids riding gas-powered mini bikes down neighborhood sidewalks like it was no big deal. You knew a toy was unforgettable when it lingered in your dreams, or maybe your nightmares. Hugo, man of 1,000 faces, was that toy. It was not soft or cuddly. It was a bald, plastic, mannequin-style head with eyes that seemed a little too real. And you could change its face. No, really. You got this kit full of rubbery noses, scars, mustaches, eyebrows, eye patches, and even glasses to transform Hugo into anything from a movie villain to a Cold War spy. You applied the features with a kind of glue stick that felt halfway between a craft tool and something out of a mad scientist's lab. This was not a toy you brought to bed with you. It was one you studied, experimented with, maybe even tried to prank your sibling with. There was something fascinating and just a bit unsettling about it. And yet, you kept going back to it. You made stories around those disguises, invented entire secret agent missions with Hugo at the center. Back in the 1970s, your imagination did most of the heavy lifting. That was the magic. And if you really wanted to get creative, especially in October, you did not go to the store for a costume. You went to the kitchen junk drawer, the recycling bin, and maybe the attic. If you wanted to feel indestructible in the 1970s, you bought a retired checker cab and drove it like your own private limousine. These things were built like bunkers. Steel frames, giant bench seats, enough legroom to host a yoga class. They were meant to haul passengers all day, every day, and because of that, they could take an unbelievable beating. When cities started retiring their fleets, the used cabs hit the market for dirt cheap, and everyday people scooped them up like hotcakes. You could legally register one as a personal vehicle, no questions asked. It was not unusual to see a checker cab parked in a suburban driveway, its faded yellow paint barely covered by an amateur paint job. They were impossible to miss and nearly impossible to wreck. Safety standards? They were considered built in by sheer size and weight. Of course, they guzzled gas like nobody's business and cornered like a refrigerator on wheels, but hey, that was a small price to pay for invincibility. Eventually, they disappeared, retired for good. And speaking of unusual rides, let us not forget about the street-legal Tuk Tuks and rickshaws that once rolled through American tourist towns like they belonged there. Owning a Trapper Keeper in the 1980s felt like owning a briefcase made just for kids, but with neon colors, Velcro, and personality. These were not just folders. These were statements. You did not just store your homework in a Trapper Keeper. You stored your identity. From bold geometric designs to wild illustrations of race cars, dolphins, or laser grids that looked like they belonged in a science fiction movie, the outside of your Trapper Keeper said something about you. And that satisfying rip of the Velcro? That was music. It had pockets for pencils, slots for notes, compartments you never used but felt cooler just knowing they were there. There was something so absurdly organized about them that it made you want to turn your life into a schedule. You would write the dates on your notebook dividers, color-code your subjects, and then forget all of it by Wednesday. But hey, the effort was there. You felt important carrying one around. It made you feel like you were growing up, and even if you never opened it for anything other than doodling weird cartoons during math class, it still felt like a win. But when it came to keeping track of things, there was one object that really made you feel like a collector, and not just of stuff, but of memories. There was no sound more powerful in the 1970s than the delicate, distant jingle of the ice cream truck. Except, it was not a jingle the way we hear it today through tinny speakers and digital loops. No, back then, the ice cream man had real brass bells. He would slowly drive down the block, gently ringing them by hand or with a string attached to the window. The sound was soft but unmistakable. It sliced through summer air like a siren of salvation. Kids would freeze mid-game, mid-bite, or a mid-sentence and yell, "Ice cream!" before bolting toward the noise barefoot, clutching whatever spare change they could dig up from a kitchen drawer or the couch cushions. The menu on the side of the truck was like a stained glass window of dreams. Push pops, rocket bombs, orange creamsicles. And if you were lucky enough to have a full dollar, you might even walk away with a cartoon character bar with gumdrop eyes that always looked just a little off. The magic was not just the treat. It was the chase, the chaos, the moment. You did not schedule a visit to the ice cream truck. You hunted it. But if you wanted to feel truly rich as a kid, it did not involve frozen sweets. It happened in the aisles of the grocery store, with something you could not eat, but you definitely collected. Yes, you read that right. Riding lawnmowers were not just for cutting grass, they were for visiting neighbors, hitting the local store, and sometimes even school drop-offs. In smaller towns, you could hop on your mower and putter right into town, past houses, dogs, and the occasional confused police officer. Nobody batted an eye. It was slow, it was loud, and it was very much not road safe, but it was legal. You did not need registration or a license, and in some places, people just threw a flag on the back and called it good. The lawnmower became an unlikely local legend. You might pass 3 of them parked at the general store like horses at a saloon. People waved like it was completely normal because, well, it was. It was practical and resourceful, and honestly, pretty charming. Today, cities and counties have all kinds of rules about non-standard vehicles on public roads. Most riding mowers now are strictly yard-bound unless you want a ticket and a lecture. But in the 1970s, nobody had time for that. If it moved and did not catch fire, it was transportation. Speaking of creative transportation, the next thing might blow your mind, because you could legally build a car in your garage from scratch and still register it for the road. MTV in the 1980s was not just a channel, it was a movement. The second you heard that iconic, "I want my MTV," you knew you were about to step into another world. A world where music lived on your screen, not just your speakers. Where your favorite artist could become a visual legend. It played music videos, actual music videos, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. That meant you could go from watching Cyndi Lauper dancing through city streets to seeing Michael Jackson turn into a werewolf without ever leaving your couch. Music became cinematic. Performances became stories. Seeing someone on TV who made you feel like you were not the only weirdo out there. And maybe, just maybe, being a weirdo was cool. MTV introduced you to bands you never heard of, genres you never explored, and visuals that burned into your brain like neon on wet pavement. You would tape videos, argue over countdowns, and swear that your favorite video was art. But when you got back to school, it was back to basics, and one look at your folder would say everything your mouth could not. If any of these brought a smile or stirred a memory, tell us your favorite down in the comments, give this video a like, and hit subscribe so you never miss another walk through the past.